So let me just tell you what the bottom line of it. There's an argument with Rav Yosef and Rav Huna bar Chia. Rav Huna bar Chia is of the opinion that you cannot extrapolate from the imposition of a fine in one case to other similar cases. So that's why I asked if Rav Nachman was imposing a fine for the informer, or was he paying enforcing compensation for the fact that this Jew lost his field? And basically, they want to know, why is it that he was even asked such a question? In other words, if the result is still payment, what's the difference? And it's exactly this point, is that if Rav Huna understood where Rav Nachman was coming from, he could say that in the case of compensatory damage, you can extrapolate a certain legal precedent to any other case. But in regards to a fine, it has to be judged on a case-by-case basis. That's all we're saying. Rav Yosef doesn't agree. Rav Yosef is saying that the principle still remains, irrespective of whether it's fine or compensation, that you can still learn the principle in similar cases. Now, we used an example in the Gemara of, well, before we get into the example, we're talking about, there's a link between indiscernible damage, groma, indirect damage, causative damage, and all of these things have certain things in common. Let me just bang it out here. The first thing of it is it's not direct and it's not measurable. So direct damage is if I steal your land and then some debt collector comes to take the land from me because of a fine that I owe, I've directly stolen your land, and therefore it also was directed at me, the debt collection. So on that basis, I'm liable. But what triggers the liability is I stole your land or occupied your land to start with. In other words, there was a direct act of acquisition. Where as far as an informer is concerned, it's a different matter, because what you have to say doesn't necessarily yield a result. If you phone and tattletale to this Internal Revenue Service or South African Revenue Service that your neighbor's got an asset base and they should look into his affairs, SARS might not take that opportunity to do so. SARS would. Let's say the IRS, they might or might not. And in that particular case, you don't know if the trouble you stirred is going to have any tangible result. So it's not direct. There's a disconnect between cause and effect. That's one of the aspects. The other one is speech considered discernible damage? And we deal with this with Adim Zomamim in Makot. We also deal with this in Sanhedrin. But one of the issues is there's a difference between ordering somebody to kill another person and actually pulling the trigger yourself. Because you can speak all you want, it doesn't do anything in terms of your direct actions. So this is also the issue at play. Then your third issue of play is what you call delayed result from causation. That is, you tie somebody to a lifeguard stand and you wait for the tide to come in. You tying that person down doesn't result in their death. A few hours later, when it goes from low tide to high tide, that results in the person's death. Or you create a trap and the person falls in and eventually starves to death. So therefore, is there liability? Now, according to some opinions, yes. According to some opinions, no. But both opinions hold that Hashem will hold you responsible and heaven will hold you responsible for cause and effect, and anything that any ramification that your speech, action, thought, and deed does on different levels. So we also discussed issues of premeditation, okay, and indiscernible damage. What is premeditation? If a guy comes home one night, he sees his wife having sex with somebody else, he will be enraged and he might kill the gentleman. And the court might have mercy on him because he was overcome by a sudden anger and resentment and almost a sense of abandonment. If the same person was with a married woman and was having an affair and decided to collect the husband's insurance money of the wife so that he could run off with her to Las Vegas, the court might not be so understanding, because the act it takes to premeditate a homicide is one of a more sinister nature. Then we've got the last issue at play, and that last issue is an issue of indiscernible damage. So biblically, there is no such thing as payment for indiscernible damage. Rabbinically, there is. So why? Because if somebody stole on Purim your Sheva's Regal whiskey, which is prohibited on Pesach because it's one of the grains, and he gives it to you after Pesach, as a Jew, you can never get benefit from it. And therefore, if that's the case, you go to court and he says, nonsense, I gave you your Sheva's Regal back. What I stole is yours before you now. And technically, he's right in that there's no discernible damage. You never broke it. You never drank half of it. You never left it in the sun where the quality deteriorated in any manner. So biblically, they could say there's no compensation, because you had compensated him, Kevin. You gave him what you took from him. That's the definition of compensation, is to rectify what you took. But Judaism recognizes another level, and that extra level is one to say this person still has a loss because he cannot benefit. There's no hanoah, benefit from what has transpired, because it's spiritually prohibited to him. And therefore the rabbis had to impose a fine to make sure that the thief would pay the cash equivalent, since this whiskey is useless to the individual. Art, you keep going on and off the camera. Are you with us, But? Okay. So no, it's distracting. I'm trying to give over some concepts, and I want you all here because I'm working quite hard at this. So those are the concepts at play. Now, if we go back to what the heck does the indiscernible damage have to do with an informer, Kevin? Why are we bringing this issue of nesech wine, tuma, truma in chulin, and all of this, as we're saying, or during Pesach, whiskey, etc., is we say these are indiscernible damage. And it's the same thing. It's indiscernible whether informing upon another Jew, if you haven't physically stolen the property, would make you liable, would make you actually liable, because it's not as if it's not as if it's tangible, as if you actually occupied the land or you stole it or you moved boundary markers, and therefore the cases are analogous, and they both fines in nature. What do the fines mean? Is that you cause somebody to lose their property by reporting them to SARS. That is not, in order to have it compensation, you have to have physically stolen it and then return it. But because land cannot really be stolen, a person can occupy land, but once they evicted, it returns to the owner. So too, when there's indiscernible damage and return that product that was stolen, and you say what is yours is before you, you might have compensated him by returning what you took, but it's ineligible for use, and therefore it has to be a fine. So Rav Huna Bachia is saying anything that's fine-based, we cannot extrapolate one legal case of a precedent to another, and Rav Yosef says, of course we can. So let me just tell you the brisa upon which they base it. There's two different brisas, and the backwards and forwards exchange. So originally they said in the brisa that one who contaminates somebody's produce with tumah, in other words, you make it spiritually impure by exposing it to a dead body or a sheretz or the like, or one who renders someone's wine nesech. So what's nesech wine? It's basically, if you're using it as a libation for idolatry, it's part of a practice, then it creates a liability to pay. And if there's a liability to pay, it's obviously going to be rabbinic, because there's nothing discernible about that wine that has been qualitatively affected. So that was the original two cases. Kevin, is it necessary?
Yeah, just a nesech wine. If they pour the whole, but if they use some of it for the idolatry, then that the wine that's poured out, the remaining liquid in the bottle hasn't been used for idolatry.
No,
So surely
they don't use that case for a specific reason, because then it's discernible damage. You've taken a liter of wine and you've taken half a liter out, so it's actually discernible. We're talking about a case where it might have not have even been used. It might have been used as part of the procedure, but nothing was drunk.
Okay.
Because the
bottle might still be sealed.
The minute something's drunk from it, let's just say, then that's discernible. You had certain amount of
Yes, because you see it's
got less.
there's missing.
Compensation. It's not a fine. Because now
so
it's sealed.
So even if it was designated for it, but wasn't, maybe the bottle was still sealed. Okay.
Yeah. And it's an excellent question Kevin's asking, because Kevin's saying, well, then only the poured part or the damaged part should be paid for. So we're saying purposely, and this is why it's such a good question, we purposely not talking about a case where there was any loss of volumetric wine, where there's discernible damage from what was to what is, or that it's been unsealed, because just like anything, if you unseal cold drink and you're trying to, or fruit juice, and you try and take it back to the shops, or you open up Sally Williams and you've consumed one and you say, I want a refund for the rest, it's not so simple. So that's exactly why Kevin's question is excellent. So we're saying the mere fact that it's used for idolatrous practice, even if you return it intact and nothing's been drunk or nothing's been unsealed, you've still got a problem in terms of discernible damage. So based on that, the first two cases is the one with Tumah, and the second case is in when you render somebody's wine nesech. Okay? So in that particular case, there was, let me just hold the share, guys, just give me a second. Okay, so the case that was added later in the brisa was as follows, is that if they said later, generations later, if somebody mixes truma in fully, they're rendered liable to pay. Okay? So this actually has an implication that because they later expressly included the case of one who mixes truma in somebody's kulin, only if the rabbis mentioned it specifically would you know that there would be liability to pay. But had it not been added, you couldn't automatically assume that there'd be liability for that indiscernible damage. Why? Because according to Rav Huna, it's a fine, and we do not extrapolate from the imposition of a fine in one case to other similar cases. Do you get what I'm saying? So in other words, what Rav Huna's proof is to Rav Yosef is the very fact that the rabbis had to generations later add a third case means that when there was a similar case in history, they couldn't automatically deduce it from the principle of a precedent of an original legal case, like in the first two cases, at the same time period. And therefore, because it needed extra rabbinical authenticity to enforce the fine, we learn from there that you cannot assume just the base principle unless each fine is enforced by the rabbinic authority on its own merit. That's his proof to Rav Yosef. Now, Rav Yosef dismisses the proof. Guys, just hang on one sec. Okay, so that's the proof against Rav Yosef. Now, Rav Yosef has a genius answer to this. He was saying, no, listen, that's not the reason the brisa deals separately with the case of one who mixes truma with somebody's chulin. The reason why that was added later is because the Tanaim of the brisa held originally that the ones that issued the decree were concerned only with preventing a major loss, as in the case of one who contaminates produce with tumah or renders wine nesech. They weren't, however, concerned with preventing a minor loss, as in the case of one who mixes truma with somebody's chulin. Why? Because we said that if you put truma in chulin, truma were only reserved for the kohanim, and therefore it didn't render it completely prohibited for benefit or consumption. It merely meant that you could sell it to the kohanim, and you had to provide a slight discount because it wasn't available to all of Israel to use, and therefore there was a minor loss. Whereas in the first two cases, with an object that you stole and you made tumah, or a case where Alternatively, you rendered one nesek because anything for idolatrous practices, you can't have any benefit whatsoever. Those are cases of major loss. So if the rabbis were concerned about cases of major loss, then a case of a minor loss would be a completely different legal case. Because in other words, it's not a comparable case where you can extrapolate one principle to another case. And then it was only later that in the end they held that those who issued the decree were as concerned with preventing a minor loss as they were for a major loss. And therefore, upon arriving at that particular understanding, they ruled that the decree also included one who mixes truma with somebody's chulin. Okay, so in other words, in other words, it's the cases are not comparable. So there's nothing to do. So the Bryce's separate mention of one who mixes truma into somebody's chulin wasn't due to some general rule regarding fines, but to its amended understanding of the decree. Therefore, the Bryce can't be construed as indicating that we generally do not extend a fine imposed in one case to another similar case. So I think that argument to Rav Huna was genius. Do you understand the argument? Arthur, are you there? You there? You're not.
Yeah, I'm just opening up a tube for my wife. Hold on. Damon, I'm just opening a tube for my wife.
Okay. I'll wait a second.
Okay. So I had to put the phone down. It's kind of hard. I can hear you. I had to put the phone down for a second. Because I can't hold and tear at the same time. Sorry about that.
Arthur's got patience. That's why he is in the medical field.
Okay, that's enough. Yeah, good. Okay, good. Okay, sorry, bro. It's just hard to tear things.
All right.
And
Okay. Okay. All right. So now there's a problem because Rav Huna has now got an excellent rebuttal to that. But so far, that sort of Rav Yosef's response is actually pretty good, if you think about it. It's pretty good. So now what we say is Rav Huna actually counters with another version of the same brisa. This is also genius. But he said, but is it so that the brisa speaks separately of one who mixes truma into somebody's chulin? Because it represents a minor loss, and not because we generally do not extrapolate a fine imposed in one case to similar cases. In other words, he's saying, listen, your reasoning is that the last case mentioned was because it was a minor loss. And therefore, you can't necessarily, according to your argument, say that a minor loss is the same as the two first cases where there was a major loss. But I'm saying that the brisa was actually interpreted in a different order. So how do we know this? How do we know he's not just inventing it? Because according to Rav Avin's father, who taught in the brisa, this is one of the big Tanoim, he taught it in the following manner. Now listen to the order carefully because this is going to break Rav Yosef's argument. The order is very careful. Yeah. Originally, the sages said that one who contaminates someone's produce with tuma, or one who mixes truma into somebody's chulin produce, both those cases of indiscernible damage are liable to pay. So he's saying originally that case when you're mixing truma into chulin, which is a minor loss to the person because there's a slight discount, and you've got contaminated produce with tuma, which is a major loss, they were mentioned both first. And then the rabbis later said that one who renders somebody's wine nesech by pouring it as an idolatrous libation is also liable to pay. So this implies that because they later extended the ruling to include the case of when one who renders somebody's wine nesech, yes, he's liable. But had they not extended that ruling to include that case, he wouldn't be liable. So what's the reason? Rav Huna is saying it's because you can't work out the imposition of a fine in one case to similar cases. So in this latest version from Rabbi Avin's father, of the brisa, the case of the minor loss mixing truma in someone's chulin when there's a slight discount given to a kohen is part of the original decree. And there's a case of a major loss, rendering somebody one nesech, representing the extended decree. So perforce, the brasa's division of the decrees can't be attributed to the different degrees of loss they prevent, because if the rabbis were very scrupulous about a minor loss, and that came first, surely a case of a major loss coming second would be an obvious cover to ensure a fine got implemented. And the only reason that it speaks separately of one who renders somebody's one nesech is that you generally can't extend a fine imposed in one case to other similar cases. Okay? So, in this case, Rav Yosef can't answer that we originally thought that the decree applied only to the case of a major loss, and then the last case was of a minor loss, because he's got Rabbi Avin's father to say that the brisa occurred in a different order. So to the contrary, guys, in this brisa, the case originally thought to be liable of one who contaminated somebody's truma and mixes truma with somebody's chulin, or cases of a minor loss, and then you thought to be exempt and you think it's two different cases. Not. So consider the following, okay? So one who makes somebody's one nesek renders it forbidden for any benefit. You can't get any hanua. You know, sometimes for tumah, we said you can't drink it, but you can sprinkle it around your house, but you just can't ingest it. But if you're saying that the nesech is the case mentioned last, you suffer the most amount of major damage there. It's not just for consumption, it's for any benefit. Whereas if the first case that's mentioned is truma and somebody's chulin, there's a minor discount. So if the rabbi said it's a case of a minor loss, there has to be financial compensation. Surely in a case where there's total loss, there's compensation. So according to Rav Huna, this seems to prove that you can't extrapolate the imposition of a fine to other similar cases. And therefore, Rav Yosef's theory goes out the window according to Rav Huna. Okay. So now Rav Yosef has to come up with some sort of a rebuttal in order to prove that there's some flaw in Rav Huna's argument. But guys, are you following so far? It's got a nice pace to it.
Yeah. It's like a good summary as well, because you covered the majority of this, so it's very good.
Okay,
Yeah.
so this is going to be a stomach puncher. So Rav Yosef rejects the proof. He says, no, that's not the reason that the brisa deals separately with the case of one who renders someone's one nesech. Rather, is if you look, it came from Rabbi Avin's father. So let's look at the opinion of Rabbi Avin, because Rabbi Avin, generally sons hold by the opinions of their father out of respect to their father, who's also their rabbi in many cases. And certainly, even if they had a separate rabbi, they go according to the traditional pattern. So it's saying, look, Rav Yosef is saying originally in the first definition in your definition of the brisa, they hold with Rabbi Yirmiyah. But in the second definition, in the first brisa, it holds with Rabbi Avin. So in other words, originally in accordance with Rabbi Avin, they therefore assume that one who renders somebody's one nesech is not included in the decree. But in the end, they held in accordance with Rav Yirmiyah that they came to realize that this person too is included in the decree. So what's going on here? Very simple. If you take the last brisa and you apply it to Rabbi Avin, because you see, the best way to convince somebody the argument is wrong is not bring your own argument. If you want to prove like Christianity is wrong, you don't bring a body of work or text like the Talmudic law where they don't hold by it, because they will not be convinced. The best thing you can do is take a flaw within their doctrine and show them the error in that. And in that way, Kevin, they are thoroughly convinced. So what Rav Yosef is doing is saying to Rav Huna, okay, so we interpret it according to Rabbi Avin's father. But then you've got a problem, because if you hold it with Rabbi Avin, there's an issue. And in the end, they held it with Rav Yirmiyah. And if you hold it by Rav Yirmiyah, that person is included in the decree. You'll see how this chess match plays out. So The Gemara explains they originally held in accordance with Rabbi Avin, for Rabbi Avin said, if one shot an arrow in the public domain on Shabbat, from the beginning of the 4-amma stretch to the end of the 4-amma stretch, is an act that carries the death penalty, and the arrow tore somebody's silk as it traveled, he's exempt from paying the silk. For the akira of the arrow, what's the akira? It's the taking flight of an arrow. It's the prerequisite for the hanacha, which is the coming to rest, the landing, and is thus part of the act for which he is liable to pay with his life. And although the moment in which he became liable to pay for the silks while the arrow was in flight preceded the moment in which he became liable to the death penalty when it landed, we nevertheless view these liabilities of having occurred simultaneously, because in order for the arrow's flight, which is the akira, it's essential for its landing, which is the hanacha. In other words, what you are saying is, in order for a plane to take flight off, the plane only crashes. Why? It doesn't crash because it crashes. It crashes because it's in the air. What started the process? The fact that it took off. Okay? So what you have is you have the akira, which is the taking flight, and you have the hanacha, which is the coming to rest, the landing or the crashing. Do you get what I'm saying? So the only time something can crash is if it's got height. It's like they say, nobody's scared of falling. It's a sudden stop that people don't like. When body meets concrete, that's what people don't like. It's not the fall. The fall's sedentary. It's when it's 911, we have an emergency, is when the final landing happens. So what the argument here is with Rabbi Avin, which is very clever, is that you've got this argument, Kim Lebedi Rabba Minay. So Kevin, if you remember what that argument was, it is you pay for the greater penalty. Okay, he stands liable to the penalty greater than it. So in other words, if one commits a capital offense at the precise moment in which he occurs a monetary liability, what happens, Gavin?
The capital offense it takes precedent.
Why?
Because of that same rule. Well, I can't pronounce it because of Kibe, whatever he said.
Kim Lebedi Rabbi Minay. So in other words, what it's saying is that if a person Arthur, let me give it to you like this. A person created 2 acts at which they render themselves liable to the death penalty. And one act of death penalty is more, not cruel, but more hectic than another. Then what happens is they can't kill the guy twice. So they choose the most serious death penalty of the 2 acts that he committed to work as a kapora for the other act which rendered a death penalty. So if the person's paying with their life, but 2 acts were created simultaneously, one of costing somebody money, like you burn a Picasso on Shabbos. You're off good news, the guy's off the $20 million. Bad news, he gets the death penalty because he broke Shabbos. So the acts occurred simultaneously. So we give the greater penalty because that works as a kapora for the lower penalty simultaneously. And therefore, this is the genius of what's going on here, is that according to Rabbi Avin, they're not 2 separate acts. The minute the arrow takes off, that's the reason why it eventually comes to land. But where's the death penalty triggered? On the landing. On the landing. Because you've gone from a public domain to, you've gone from a private domain to a public domain. And when it went from a public, just hang on, Kevin. If you go from a private to a public with witnesses and warnings, etc., at that particular case, you transgress the rule of Shabbos, at which somebody is liable for the death penalty. But if a tore silks while in midair, at that point, he's not liable for the death penalty. So in other words, it might have gone from the public to the private. It's where it landed, if it changed domains. So it tore it in midair, and it landed in a private yard. When it landed is when he's liable. But it wouldn't have landed if it never took off. Therefore, Rabbi Avin sees the time at which the starting point occurred and the end point occurred at one simultaneous act, extended act, but it still protracted the act into one simultaneous act. And therefore, if the silks were torn at the time before the arrow came to rest, he's off the hook because of Kim Labadi Rabba Mina. He only pays a death penalty, not the lesser penalty. So what does that have to do with the Nesech wine? Well, it's very simple. So if when one incurs a when one incurs a monetary liability simultaneously with a capital offense, he now becomes exempt from the monetary obligation. Therefore, this fellow is exempt from paying for the silks that he damaged, if it was the same protracted act as breaking Shabbos. Likewise, in the case of one who renders somebody's wine nesech. Basically, as soon as he lifts the wine, he has committed an act of theft for which he incurs a monetary liability. Okay? And true, he becomes liable to the death penalty for idol worship only later, when he pours the wine as a libation for an idol. Still, since he must lift the wine to perform the libation, the act of idol worship is considered to have begun with the lifting of the wine, and therefore it exempts him from paying simultaneous act of theft, because it's only theft once he acquires it. And the Tanaim of the Bryce at first held like Rabbi Avin, and they therefore assumed that one who renders somebody's wine nesech is exempt. Because why does he not have to pay any money? Because he was involved in idolatrous practices. That's why, Kevin. So only afterwards, when they said it wasn't a protracted act and they were two separate acts, according to Rav Yirmiyah, in that particular case, they added the later case because he automatically exempt himself from payment, because for the idolatrous act mentioned last, it's in that case that he became liable to the death penalty. And that's why it wasn't mentioned originally, because he wouldn't have had to pay if he got the death penalty. So it says, since he must lift the wine to perform the libation, the act of idol worship is considered to have begun with the lifting of the wine. It therefore exempts him from paying for simultaneous act of theft. The Tanaim of the Bryce at first held like Rabbi Avin that it's a protracted act, and they therefore assumed that one who renders somebody's wine nesech is exempt from the financial liability because they get the death penalty. But in the end, they held like Rav Yirmiyah, because Rav Yirmiyah said regarding one who renders somebody's wine nesech, from the moment he lifted the wine, he acquired it as stolen property. And at that point exactly, he immediately became liable to pay for having stolen it. But he's not liable to pay for his life until the moment he actually pours the wine for idol worship. So he stole it at first, and that's what made him liable. And that meant that he didn't become liable to the death penalty until after he became liable to pay. But since the wine is now prohibited for use, he pays, and he's not simultaneously off the hook, because A, it's not a protracted act, and B, the theft was the first act. The fact that it became rendered unfit in the second act is a separate case at which that's for idolatrous practice. So you could say if it became indiscernible damage at the idolatrous practice, why would he have to pay? Because it was the first case of the theft that triggered him to pay. The rabbis just said that since the wines become indiscernible, you have to at least pay the financial equivalent. But it wasn't the act of the idol worship that rendered it unfit for use. It was the first act of theft, when he stole it, that rendered it responsible for use. So since the brisa of Rabbi Avin's father can be interpreted in this manner, it can't serve as proof that we do not generally extend a fine imposed in one case to similar cases. So all we're saying quickly, guys, is according to Rav Yosef, we do extend a fine imposed in one case to another similar case. And when the brisa taught by Rabbi Avin's father initially exempted one from who renders somebody's wine nesech, it does so because it assumed that the act of lifting the wine and the act of pouring the wine are regarded as having occurred simultaneously as one extended protracted act. So the fellow become liable to pay at the precise moment that there was a death penalty, and therefore it means he wouldn't have to pay. But Rav Yirmiyah says that, in fact, the acts are not simultaneous, and it no way constitutes proof that when we hold by Yirmiyahu later, and it's added that we do not extrapolate from a fine imposed by one case to another. So accordingly, also there's something very important here, is that Rav Yirmiyah holds that the primary obligation is incurred with stealing of the wine. And if it wasn't for the rabbinical decree, he could simply return it to the owner. But the fact that he rendered it forbidden for benefit, if he did that on his own without stealing the wine, in other words, if he did an idolatrous practice at the person's house, the person couldn't use it, but because it was kimlei b'di rabbi minei, he wouldn't have to pay. And also, Rav Yirmiyah says that lifting is not essential to the pouring of it. And because the idolatrous practice is the pouring, not the lifting, it's not lifting it out of somebody's house or lifting the cup up that creates the kimlei b'di rabbi minei, as the death penalty for idol worship, and therefore he's off the hook for the financial obligation. He's saying the act is for actually pouring, and you can do that even without stealing at the person's house. So since lifting is not essential to pouring, they're not viewed as a single protracted act. And Rabbi Avin has said it's like an arrow taking flight and landing. It's part of the same protracted act. So that's what Rabbi Yirmiyah is holding, that it's two acts, and Rabbi Avin is holding it's one protracted act. We're done. Any questions?
So you want to say something, Gavin?
No, you had a question. No.
Yeah, the question is, okay, so the guy stole the wine.
Yeah.
But at that time of theft, if he didn't have intention at that point where he acquired the stolen wine, that he was going to use it for idolatrous practices, and then had charota and decided to give it back, then it's there's nothing and sealed everything. There's no indiscernible damage,
That's
just
fine.
as is. So that's
fine. But
yeah.
the problem is here.
Is that what Rav Yirmiyah was saying?
No, they're two separate acts. The first one was the stealing of the wine, and the one was using the wine for idolatrous practices. So for stealing the wine, that's what he has to give back the wine.
Yes.
But because it's now been used for idolatrous practices, it wasn't the monetary obligation that. It's not like he damaged somebody's goods on Shabbos, where when they broke Shabbos, he caused the damage then. He first caused the damage by stealing, and then he used it for idolatrous practices. And because they were two separate acts, kimlei b'di rabbi minei, the execution doesn't get him off the hook for the monetary liability at all. So that doesn't, and even Rav Yirmiyah says, listen, the act of lifting and the act of pouring are two separate acts. So if he lifted off somebody's dining room table, or he lifted the thing in honor, it has nothing to do with it. It's the pouring. So the question then would arise is that, okay, so why would he have to, if it was indiscernible damage at the act of idol worship, why would he have to replace it monetarily? Because it's kimlei b'di rabbi minei. Because the rabbis had mercy on this person that was stolen from and said, but his actual act of theft is what caused the damage. And it's not one long protracted act, they're two separate acts. So it holds by Rav Yirmiyah, and that's why they had to add that fine. Not that we can't extrapolate fines from fines, Rav Yosef said. It was we hold by Rav Yirmiyah instead of Rabbi Avin in the later generations. And that's it. Right, guys, we're done with that concept only.
The same as when you go into a shop and you get 2 for 1, right? Sometimes the products are different prices. So they always take the bigger one you pay for,